Internal Revenue Service IRS Tax News. New Spanish language version unveiled. Use IRS non-filers enter payment info here tool to get economic impact payment. Many low-income homeless qualify. IR 2020-83, April 28, 2020, Washington. The Internal Revenue Service today reminds low-income Americans to use the free online tool, Non-Filers Enter Payment Info Here. So there's a link to that here. There'll be a link to this in the description back to the text to quickly and easily register to receive their economic impact payment. So this is going to be a tool that will be used in specific types of situations, and typically those situations are going to be with people that are making under a certain dollar amount and therefore don't need to file and are not receiving income from other type of government source where the government would know who that individual is. So if you're receiving payment, for example, from like a Social Security and you don't file tax returns because you're not over that threshold for taxable income to do so, then they should still know who you are. But if you're under a certain dollar amount and therefore don't need to file and you're not getting payments from any of these specific government entities where the IRS can get the information to still process the return, then that's when you'd want to use the non-filer enter payment info here, or that's one of the reasons that you would want to go to, and that's who they're focusing in on with this update. Back to the text. The IRS has recently released a new Spanish language version of the tool to help even more Americans get their money quickly and easily. Quote, the IRS is working hard to find new ways for people who don't have a filing requirement to receive their economic impact payment. So again, key term here, they don't have an economic filing requirement. Who doesn't have an economic filing requirement? People whose taxable incomes are not over a certain threshold in which they would need to file and therefore don't need to file. And people who don't have a filing requirement. You also want to consider if you're getting payments from other governmental institutions where the IRS is working with those institutions and then therefore can still process the payment without the added information possibly. If you don't fall into that group and you're not required to file, then you're going to have to give the IRS information, which would typically be a tax return. But in this case, they have a tool that'll make it easier than filing the full tax return because they don't need the income information. So it should be an easier thing to do. Back to the text. Said IRS Commissioner Chuck Rettig, quote, the non-filers tool is an easy way people can register for these payments. I appreciate the work of the Free File Alliance to quickly develop a Spanish language version of this tool to reach additional people. This is part of a wider effort to reach underserved communities, end quote. The non-filers enter payment info here tool is designed for people with incomes typically below $24,400 for married couples or less than $12,200. So those are basically, and you can think of those as kind of like the requirements of income, taxable income you would need to have in order to be required to file. And typically those are taxable income. So if you're getting some kind of income that's it may not be qualified for taxable, then that might not be included in part of this number to see if you're required to file the tax return or not. But again, generally, the focus right now for this particular thing is looking at people whose incomes are under this threshold and probably do not get payments from some other institution, government institution the IRS can then work with. Those are the people that may be falling through the cracks that aren't getting the information they could without the added resource and the added information to the IRS. Back to the text. This includes couples and individuals who are homeless. People can qualify even if they do not work. Anyone claimed as a dependent by another taxpayer is not eligible. So this dependent thing has caused some confusion as well. So if you're a dependent on another tax return, then they basically kind of get some type of benefit from you being a dependent. So typically you wouldn't qualify if you're claimed as a dependent on another tax return. Now there's a little bit of kind of funniness with that because typically the people who claim the individual as a dependent could possibly get an added $500 to their payment, but only if the individual is under 17. So if you're talking about older dependents like parents or something like that, or students that are over 17 and dependents, then they kind of fall into limbo area where there just doesn't seem to be an actual benefit for those individuals for some reason. So, but the bottom line is if you're a dependent on someone else's tax return, the question is, can they then claim the extra $500 based on you being a dependent on their tax return? And that will typically only be the case if you were under 17. If you're claimed as a dependent on someone else's tax return and you're over 17, not a qualifying child, then there may not be a benefit for that. So back to the text. Usually married couples qualifying to receive the $2,400 payment, while others normally qualifying to get $1,200. So obviously if you're a single individual, they're going to process your payment $1,200, and that's basically all they need to know. You're an individual, are you, your contact information, where to send the check to, or your banking information. And obviously, if you're married, they just doubled it, right? So they doubled it, $2,400 if married. Then back to the text. People with dependents under 17 can get up to an additional $500 for each child. So that's where the dependent thing falls into place. Again, it's a dependent who is under 17. Those aren't all the dependents. You could be over 17 and be a dependent, but you're only going to get the benefit if you have that qualifying child dependent, and the benefit being that added $500. Back to the text. Just like people who file returns every year, those who do not have a filing requirement also generally qualify for an economic impact payment. The IRS doesn't know how many of these people are since they normally don't file. So they don't know who many of these people are because many of them don't normally file. But again, if you do get payments in some other way, like Social Security payments or something like that, and aren't required to file, then they can kind of figure out who you are. But if you don't file and you don't get some of these other government payments, then they don't know who you are. So they would need this tool to be used. Back to the text. So the only way to get the economic impact payment is to register with the IRS. Here are some questions and answers on the non-filer tool. How do I use the non-filer tool? Enter payment info here tool. For those who don't normally file a tax return, the process is simple and only takes a few minutes. First, visit the irs.gov website. This is the IRS website. Remember, make sure that you're going directly to the IRS website, the irs.gov, and look for non-filers enter payment info here. Then provide basic information including Social Security number, name, address, and dependents. The IRS will use and notice, by the way, that as you enter that information, pretty basic information, and notice there's no income information. They're not filing a tax return. They're not looking for your W-2 information and that kind of thing, because they're assuming, the assumption here being that you're below the income limitation, and therefore they don't need the whole tax return because you're under the threshold to process this economic impact payment, so they just need the info. Back to the text. The IRS will use this information to confirm eligibility calculation, send an economic impact payment. No tax will be due as a result of receiving the payment. So you might say, well, what if I get the payment? Is that going to be taxable income? And typically the answer is no. No tax is typically going to be due as a result of receiving the payment. So back to the text. Entering bank or financial account information will allow the IRS to quickly deposit the payment directly in a savings or checking account. So if you have a savings or checking account, they really are emphasizing that because it can help you to get the payment faster, especially during this time when the IRS is underserved in terms of their workforce due to social distancing. Back to the text. Otherwise, the payment will be mailed, which will take longer to receive than direct deposit. So if you want it by mail, it'll just take longer, but that should be okay as well. Back to the text. Non-filers. Enter payment info is secure and the information entered will be safe. The tool is based on free fileable forms, part of the Free File Alliance's offerings of free products on irs.gov, irs.gov. Who should use the non-filers enter payment info tool? This new tool is designed for people who did not file their tax return for 2018 or 2019 and are not qualified to do so under the law. Usually this means couples with income below $24,400 and singles with income below $12,200. So general requirement, you didn't file in 2019, you didn't file in 2018. The reason you didn't file isn't because you just didn't file and were required to, but because you weren't required to file. Typically, the reason you would not be required to file is because your income is below a certain threshold. That threshold typically being for married individuals, $24,400, for single, $12,200. Now again, just caveat here, if you didn't file and you're getting some payments from some other source, such as Social Security or something like that, then they may still have your information. They may be able to process your information without this added tool. But if you do not get payments from some other location, then you would want to provide them with that basic information to process the payment back to the text. In addition, the non-filer tool can also help families receiving certain government benefits get additional payment amounts based on their children. So again, that's going to be one of those special caveats. Again, if you get some other kind of payment like Social Security or something like that, then you should be okay. You shouldn't need this tool in general. But if you get a payment for something like Social Security and you have a qualifying child that the IRS doesn't know about, then you may have to use this tool. Even though they know who you are, they don't know who the qualifying child is, and therefore they wouldn't be issuing that 500, the plus 500, so you'd have to use the tool to give them that information back to the text. These include those receiving Supplemental Security Income, SSI, and Veterans Affairs beneficiaries who did not file returns for 2018 or 2019. These recipients need to make the updates for the children in the tool by May 5th. So their deadline here, May 5th. By taking this step, they will still be eligible to receive the separate payment of $500 per qualifying child. See the new release for full details. So there's a link to that here. Who should not use the non-filer interpayment info here tool? Anyone who already filed 2018 or 2019 return does not qualify to use this tool. So obviously, if you filed your 2019 or 2018 return, they already have your information, and so you typically then wouldn't qualify for the tool. They should be basing your calculation based on the actual tax returns that were filed either in 2018 or 2019. Similarly, anyone who needs to file either a 2018 or 2019 return should not use this tool. So in other words, they're saying if you didn't file 2018 or 2019 because you just chose not to, even though you're required to do so, you might think, oh, I'll just use this tool, it'll be easier. But no, they're saying, if you're required to file the 2018 and 2019 return, then you need to file the return. But if you're not required to do so because you're under the income limitation and don't need to file a return, that's when you'd use the tool back to the text. But instead, they should file their tax returns. This includes anyone who files a return to claim various tax benefits, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, or low and moderate income workers and working families. The IRS also has seen instances where people required to file a Form 1040 for 2019 are trying to use the non-filers tool. The IRS urges people with a filing requirement to avoid complications later with the IRS and file properly without using the non-filer tool. So they're basically saying, if you use the non-filer tool to process something, the indication to the IRS is that you're not required to file a tax return. And if you then file a tax return in 2019 after using the non-filer tool, which would indicate you're not required to do so, it could cause complications. You're going to confuse the IRS, which is not that difficult to do, to be honest. So back to the task. Students and others who file a return only to receive a refund of withheld taxes should also not use this tool. In addition, students and others claimed as dependents on someone else's tax return don't qualify for an economic impact payment and are not eligible to use the non-filers tool. So there's many students out there who are still going to be dependents because they're over the age of 17, but they're going to school, so they're dependents, so they're qualified dependents on someone else's tax return, and they're kind of in limbo because they're not under the 17, so their parents are claiming them as a dependent, and they don't get the added 500 even though they're a dependent, and they don't get the added the money either because they're a dependent on someone else's tax return. So they may still be filing a tax return, but it's just basically to get the withholdings back from any kind of work that they did, most likely because they're being claimed as a dependent by their parent, and typically they wouldn't use the tool because they're not going to be qualifying for the economic impact payment in that situation. For more information on economic impact payment, including answers to frequently asked questions and other resources, you can visit the irs.gov/coronavirus.